Okay, so colonialism and imperialism. What is the difference? Why does the different matter? Well, for Robert J.C. Young, whom you've already read, if at least you've read chapters from his long and really powerful uh, book, Post Colonialism and Historical Introduction, chapters 1 and 2, the first on colonialism, the second on imperialism. Uh, he wants to conceptually distinguish between these two different systems of power, different but similar, I should say, uh, in order to pay very close attention as to how and why it is that the practice of these systems of dominance, power, and control can be subverted and critiqued, right? Uh, Resisted, displaced, undermined once and for all in a way that is sensitive to the particular dynamics of a particular system of power, dominance, and control. And imperialism and colonialism also, they are synergistic in a way, and it's usually the case that colonialism precedes in imperialism, right? So you want to develop a very rigorous distinction between these two concepts in order to understand these very complicated historical phenomenon. Okay, so I'm just going to quote Young here and read him out. He says, "quote The basic difference emerges between an empire that was bureaucratically controlled by a government from the center and which was developed for ideological as well as financial reasons, a structure that can be called imperialism, and an empire that was developed for settlement by individual communities or for commercial purposes by a trading company, a structure that can be called colonial." Okay. And what he means by an empire that is bureaucratically controlled by a government from the center. He means the center of a, a empire, right? So in the case of the British Empire, uh, the largest and most powerful empire that the world has ever known, uh, the center would be, the state, right? Which is to say, London, where the state is located, right? Uh, Command control center, if you will. I'm not sure if I really like that metaphor, but it'll have to do. So colonization was pragmatic and until the 19th century generally developed locally in various parts of the world in a haphazard, just say disorganized, accidental sort of way, right? For example, the occupation of islands in the West Indies or the Caribbean in Australia. Okay, Christopher Columbus just happened upon the island of Hispaniola by accident, and then he saw that it was rich with natural resources, namely gold, for that matter, and there was a lot of labor power in the form of indigenous labor that he could exploit through a host of techniques. Let's just say that I don't have the time to get into, but can you imagine how gruesome and awful and just frankly immoral those techniques were? So while colonization was pragmatic and until the 19th century generally developed locally in a haphazard way, while imperialism was typically driven by ideology from the metropolitan center and concerned with the expansion of state power. Okay? Colonialism functioned as an activity on the periphery of uh, the place from where the colonizers came. So using the example of Britain, right? So colonialism functioned as an activity on the periphery. To give you an example from the British Empire, India was formerly a colony of Britain. Okay, uh, so colonialism is economically driven, and from the home government's perspective, is at times hard to control. Imperialism, on the other hand, operated from the center as a deliberate policy of state driven by the grandiose projects of power, say world dominance, if you will. That's why imperialism is susceptible to analysis as a concept. Colonialism needs to be analyzed primarily, but not only, but primarily as a practice. It's a matter of doing things, right? So, in short, these are my words, colonialism is a practical and logistical matter. It's more hands on and concrete. The question of how to get to foreign lands by sea, how to maintain order within the society of colonizers, how to set up outposts for trade, how to contend with potentially unruly indigenous peoples, how to appropriate or claim as your own and cultivate foreign soil for purposes of agriculture and commerce, or feeding and tending to the needs of colonizers. All of these are questions that are central to the business of colonization. Now, as Young mentions, from the perspective of the home government or state, colonization was, quote, at times hard to control, end quote. One of the many problems of colonization is the matter of justification. As one might imagine, colonists in their interactions with alien, threatening environments in indigenous peoples, they surely experience doubts about the justice, legitimacy, or even the profitability of creating and maintaining an empire. So not all the colonists were necessarily on board with this business of colonizations, right? Uh, Thus, the way bureaucrats and statesmen represent the aim and objectives or the reasons for colonization in law, policy, speech, and writing is crucial to the maintenance of political order. So when we talk about imperialism, we're not talking about concrete, practical, and technical matters. When we talk about imperialism, we're primarily talking about ideas, discourse, storytelling, narrative, language. How is it you fashion a particular and compelling story about the whys and wherefores of this business of colonialism? That's what imperialism is about. So the business of imperialism is primarily a political matter. It's a matter of representing the legitimacy of empire, which is largely a matter of explaining and justifying the practice of colonialism. You might be familiar with ideological phrases or ideas such as the white man's burden or civilizing the savage. Such phrases make the grubby, violent, and hard work of colonization seem noble and even necessary for that matter. Thus, you might think of imperialism as a set of political and textual strategies an empire utilizes to represent, explain, and justify the business or the practical matter of colonization in public discourse. Okay? One textual strategy that has been used throughout imperial history is to represent European identity in strict opposition with the colonized. so that the identity of the colonizer is represented as the diametrical opposite of the colonized. Now, a great deal of Western thought is organized through what are called binary oppositions. You remember this from the unit on deconstruction. For example, reason is a concept traditionally organized against the passions or the irrational, appetites, emotions, desire, the pleasure principle, what have you. The civilized is juxtaposed against its conceptual opposite, the savage. The human is defined against this notion of the animal. The masculine is understood to be substantially different than the feminine, and so on and so forth. Note also how these binary oppositions that I just mentioned virtually map onto each other. So that one binary set, for instance, reason versus passion, civilized, savage, or masculine, feminine, human, animal, what have you, uh, they virtually map onto each other so that one binary set structurally mirrors other sets to form a complete system of thought. That is, taken as a whole, all of the binary sets can be said to constitute what we have referred to as discourse. This kind of story that empires tell themselves about their identity versus the identity of those whom they wish to have power over, right? So the imperial catchphrases I mentioned above, the white man's burden and civilizing the savage, imply, right, a conceptual apparatus that presupposes or assumes fundamental differences between the status and the being, for that matter, of white male Europeans, the colonizers, and non European others, which is to say, the colonized. As we have discussed, the conceptual binaries that have historically determined ways of seeing otherness or difference in Western consciousness condition and limit the colonizer's point of view, which is to say, the subjectivity of the colonizer. This is important for us to keep in mind when we interpret the British characters, for example, in Wide Sargasso Sea, or any of the white characters in J.M. Coetzee's Age of Iron, for their attitudes toward blacks and Creoles, as implied by their respective points of view, tend to, but not necessarily always, abet their political, culture, and economic dominance. And one might say, and this is just by the way, that Elizabeth Curran would be an example of a descendant of European colonizers who is a thoughtful professor of classics, yes, and is not on board with and is highly critical of the system of apartheid, but still, manages to be, you know, caught up in these narratives, these ideological narratives about the differences between white people and black people. And Verculiel seems to be an interesting character in the novel in as much as he has a way of mirroring that and showing that to Elizabeth Curran. And her responses to that kind of mirroring are instructive because she sees herself through Verculiel's eyes, right? And is able to become critical towards herself and also transform her perspective, her values, her ways of seeing by degrees. In other words, she overcomes and transcends colonialist discourse or colonialist ideology, which is also caught up with racial or racist systems of ideas or racist ideologies for that matter. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here. The next video lecture will be on ideology and also colonialist discourse, and then we're going to be done for the day. And I'll record a few more videos in the coming days for you to view. Okay.